Hi everyone, we'll just give people another couple of minutes before we get going properly, but it's wonderful to see you all and start getting going with the webinar really shortly. We still see people coming in, which is really wonderful. Okay, I'm aware that there'll still likely be some people to join, but I want to make sure that we make our best use of the time we have available to us. So I'm going to get going, but of course people will still be joining as we kick off. So let me say a big welcome and thank you for everyone here for joining us on our second CTIQ webinar, Options for Flexible Trial Delivery, Minimising Burden and Maximising Benefit. For those of you that I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet, it's lovely to see you. My name's Dr. Lisa Eckstein and I have the privilege of directing the CTIQ program. CTIQ is an Australian member-based organisation that takes on projects to improve the efficiency, quality and effectiveness of Australian clinical research, including this, our 11th continuous improvement project on the flexible trial delivery. I do want to acknowledge that I have the privilege of joining you from Nipaluna, Hobart, on the unceded land of the Norninia people. I pay my respects to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, past and present, and extend my respects to all First Nations people who may be on the call with us today. I want to start by giving something of a sense of how today's webinar is going to work. As I mentioned, we have an incredible group of people here with us for an hour, and it's really a webinar in two parts. The first part of our webinar is going to be hearing from Dr. Tanya Symons, really based on a report that she produced for CTIQ towards the end of 2023. This was a mapping report, as Tanya will detail, to get a sense of where we're at currently in Australia when it comes to decentralised clinical trials, including teletrials. What activities are already underway? What activities are planned for the near future? And what are the different groups that are active in the space and the relationships between us? Now, many of you will already be familiar with Tanya. She's a core figure of the Australian clinical research sector. But for those of you who may not be aware of Tanya already, she's a clinical trial consultant in Australia and in the United Kingdom. She's authored national clinical trial guidelines and toolkits in both countries. Once we've heard from Tanya, we'll move over to the second part of our webinar today, which is an expert panel discussion on implementing flexible trial delivery in Australia. And we're lucky enough to have three amazing panellists with us today, each with quite different backgrounds and roles in the clinical trial sector. First up is going to be Taylor Major, who's the Director of Commercial Operations at Obvio Health, a software vendor focused on optimising remote data capture. They're also currently writing a PhD on the feasibility of the decentralised clinical trial model in Australia. Next up will be Jerneen Williams, who's the Director of Operations at Bellbury Limited. In her role for Bellbury, Jerneen's really aware of current trends in the types of research being undertaken in Australia, as well as how they're being reviewed by Australian human research ethics committees. Our third panellist is Dr. Priyakshi Kalita-de Croft, who is the Program Manager for the Australian Teletrials Program National Office. In this role, Priya works to implement teletrials nationally and with partner organisations. Alongside us in this webinar, we have visual storyboard artist Dr. Sue Pillans. Any of you who were with us for our CTIQ Informed webinar will have already seen the visual storyboard prowess of Dr. Pillans, and we're really looking forward to her capturing our discussion today and putting it into an output that can be really readily accessible to the whole of the clinical research sector. We also have our CTIQ Research Officer, Gudrun Wells, on the call with us. I've put Gudrun's email address up there. If you need extra assistance during the webinar, if something isn't working for you, please do reach out to Gudrun and she'll do her best to assist you. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. Please do put your questions into the Q&A section of your webinar. Chat is disabled, but Q&A is enabled to allow us to capture your questions. You'll notice that there's something I haven't done because I've been talking about flexible trial delivery, but some of you may have noticed I haven't actually defined it yet. I haven't told you what I think flexible trial delivery means, and that's actually rather intentional because part of what we want to do with today's discussion is not just provide information to you. We also want to get some information from you about what you think flexible trial delivery means or what you'd like it to mean. So I would invite you now to go to www.menti.com or to use the QR code on the screen. And once you're there, to answer this question for us of what does flexible trial delivery mean to you? It's really interesting seeing anywhere and any time being highlighted here, as well as equity, accessibility. Opt-in and opt-out. Really interesting seeing any time, accessibility and equity really at the centre here. I also see some other words. I see complicated. See opt-in and opt-out. Different ways. So ideas that this might be something that's good, but something that needs to be measured, something that needs to be thought through. Okay, that's a really, really interesting start. That provides us with some really useful words to get going with. I'm seeing flexible options, location, patient-centred, patient-friendly, varied techniques. So always that this isn't about providing one option to people, it's about seeing what are the multitude of ways that we can get to this core word of accessibility. So with that at the back of all of our minds, I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Tanya Symons to lead us through the key findings from the CTIQ Decentralised Clinical Trials Mapping Report that Tanya produced for CTIQ.
Thank you, Lisa, and hi everyone from me. Just a really quick whistle-stop tour of that mapping exercise. But actually, before we do that, I thought it might be useful just to clarify some of the main terminology that tends to be used. I think Lisa may have done this already, but we're talking today about flexible trial delivery models. Obviously, that's not a model in itself. That's just, as Lisa said, and you all said, in fact, it's about ways we can operationalize clinical trials in the future in probably infinite ways, in fact. So things that I think, one of the words is complex, I think, in the future as well, because I think things can be quite complex. So what I'll do is I'll go through three of the key definitions, and I just want to mention where they come from. In 2022, ARCS did a digital trial summit, and one of the pain points, guess what, was lack of common understanding of terminology in this area. So there was a working group convened. Lisa was on it, thank goodness, and we had a great time sort of trying to find some definitions everybody was happy with. So it's a start, but I think the most important thing to say about this document is it's going to have to be a living document for a very long time, because things are changing so rapidly, it's unbelievable. So anyway, let's get to some definitions. One of the key definitions, obviously, is what is a DCT? And it's a trial where some or all activities are conducted or separate from the investigator's location. That was taken from the FDA, who have very authoritative guidance. Interestingly, they've just updated their guidance, and they've gone on a line with Europe to some extent in terms of the title of their guidance. They're now talking about trials with decentralized elements as another way of illustrating just how flexible things can be in the future. People often ask, what's the difference between a hybrid trial and a decentralized trial? So here's a quick summary. Basically the same, except not all. I don't know if you can see that. Some or all in the DCT definition. It's basically just some activities are conducted, away from the investigator's location. And then, of course, we have in Australia definitions for teletrials, currently in the SOPs for teletrials. I've put some of it up because I've run out of space, but the key defining aspects of a teletrial, as I'm sure you know, is the use of telehealth technology and also the use of the lovely supervision plan. And I've looked at the new supervision plan which has been developed, and all I can say is bravo, because it is eminently flexible, which is what we want. It has an other box, which I always love in things, because that always makes things flexible when you can choose what you want to do. So in terms of how things are delegated, etc. So there we go. So they're the three definitions. Something else I get asked internationally, because as I say, I have contacts with many countries, is okay then, so what's the difference between our knowledge of the DCT and your teletrial? So I thought we'd show you the diagram that has been produced in a paper that some of us wrote, including Lisa and John Zaltberg and Anne Willett from VCCC. So here we go. So this is what other countries generally think about when they think about decentralized trials. They think about a trial site and then somewhere else a participant. And around that participant are various service providers like local labs, local GPs, local radiology, etc., healthcare at home that might come and visit them, and they wear sensors, and everything is quite digital. That's the thing. This is data-driven and digital technology in the international model, and you can see that reflected in the guidance internationally. Whereas obviously here we have a slightly variable model, which I think is great. We interpose health systems or health centers between the PI or whoever and the participant. And the value of this is that brings more trial. It opens up to more trials where you really need the safety of a health center, but more trials closer to home, because we can have that option as well. And I think that's really, really important. And we are trying to tell the world this is another model that can be used. Okay, so that's the terminology. I'm going to sort of quickly mention four things that came out of the report. the first one is that question, which actually I've already gone over, is what are we doing in Australia? Are we just doing teletrials, or are we going to broaden our model? And very much the feedback is, yes, we ought to make sure we are planned for every type of trial. We don't want to discourage sponsors whose knowledge of DCTs is the international model from coming to Australia. So, you know, eventually it will be all about not only teletrials, and it is currently, but also DCTs that are more decentralized than a teletrial. The other thing that came up quite a lot in the discussions was we really do need practical guidance. That's not surprising because, you know, we've been doing conventional trials for donkey's years, and now we're moving to these very fast, probably the fastest ever, as far as, I mean, I've been doing trials for 35 years nearly, but the fastest ever change and disruptive change in terms of what we're doing. So we really need that guidance. Ethics and governance training was also very much mentioned, because the fear, I think, is that if they aren't absolutely on top of some of the ethical issues, for example, in an ethics committee, and there are many ethical issues, different ethical issues in decentralized trials, such as, you know, is it going to increase the burden on participants to make them do all the stuff themselves at home? Or, you know, are novel endpoints scientifically sound? That's another example of an ethical issue. So there are ethical issues, and we really need to make sure we plan ahead and make sure everybody has the relevant training to do their job efficiently and do their review, in this case, efficiently. So ethical issues, but also definitions. You know, I think this has been a real something that people often talk to me about. You know, what's the difference between oversight and supervision? I get asked a lot. You know, well, these are things we need to really nail down in the future. And then the other very common theme that was raised from the interviews that I did was, okay, is the tail going to wag the dog? Do the systems we have, whether they're ethics or governance or CTMSs or whatever else we're using for clinical trials, going to be able to accommodate the new ways of working? And I think that, you know, thank goodness we've got one-stop shop, because obviously we can make sure that we may even have the first you know, national systems for ethics and governance that will accommodate, because we're doing it right now with all of this in mind. And complexity. I couldn't resist putting this slide up, because to me, this says it all in terms of how things are going to get more complex, especially with data flows in the future. And we really need to understand how the exchange of data and processes will happen across diverse platforms, for example, systems and stakeholders. And, you know, I think, yeah, I won't put that up anymore, but it just shows us where we're going, you know, in the future. And then finally, a very common bit of feedback was there's a lot of good work going on in Australia, more so, honestly, I keep in touch with other countries, more so than many other countries. And what we should be doing is sharing that so that nobody reinvents the wheel. So I often got people saying to me, you know, there really should be one place we put all this so everybody knows where to go to find out what to do, so they don't start from scratch. And I love that concept, and so I wanted to mention that. And finally, you know, site CVs. We've all, you know, many international sponsors and sponsors that come to Australia that are, you know, industry led, know who they go to for conventional trials. They've gone to them for a long time. They don't know yet who is trained in teletrials, who is trained in DCTs, and we're going to have to make sure that we really make that visible so that it doesn't hold up the approval process. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Tanya. It's always so incredible to hear your experiences and thoughts, and you've just, you know, such a depth of experience both here and overseas. Now, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment in the Q&A for Tanya, which might just mean that people haven't realised they're allowed to put questions in. So what I'll do is I'll roll any questions for Tanya in with our Q&A at the end of today. And I am going to move over and bring onto the screen our other panellists for the second part of our webinar. So I'll bring on Taylor, Priya, and Jerneen. I've already introduced Taylor, Priya and Jerneen formally, so I won't do that again other than to express my gratitude again at having the three of you join today. I'm really excited for everyone to hear your words, and one of the things that we pride ourselves on with CTIQ is really being collaborative about bringing voices from all facets of the sector together to share experiences and views, and recognising that together we can be greater than any one of our parts. So thank you all for being back for us today. We're going to keep this pretty informal. I'm going to stay light touch and leave it to our panellists. And each of our three panellists has been asked to answer the same three questions. So I'm going to go Taylor, then Jerneen, then Priya in answering the questions, but otherwise I'll stay on the sidelines unless needed. And the three questions are as follows. What does flexible trial delivery mean to me? What are the benefits and challenges with flexible trial delivery? And what do we need to move forward with flexible trial delivery in Australia? So with those three questions, I'm going to pass over to Taylor Major to kick us off, and I'll take the rest of us off screen.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for being here today. Really important topic, and I'm excited to see our group of professionals across Australia talking about this more. So for me, looking at my background in flexible trial delivery and what does this mean, what does it look like to me? So my background has been working in decentralized clinical trials internationally. So I've worked a little bit more so across APAC, US and EU than just strictly here in Australia. But what I've really seen is that while there's been an approach to how can we do things in a different way, are there different tools that we can use that fit the population for each study or each site or each location or the different PIs? How can we best fit that scenario? There has been a lot more reliance on that hybrid model of a flexible trial here in Australia rather than, say, in the US. So while in the US, when they're looking to flexible trial deliveries, I've seen a lot more of, okay, how can we be flexible to our participants and keep that data capture at home? Or wherever our participant may be, that might be while they're still in hospital and completing data capture on their phone or wearing a wearable, for example, and then continuing that data capture when they get home. But when we're looking at the Australian model, we're definitely seeing that more hybrid, flexible approach, where some of, or the majority of the data is being captured while the participant is on site. And that's being supplemented by some perhaps e-pro questions and e-diary. Maybe they're wearing a wearable, maybe they're wearing a GCM that is transmitting back to the site. Having just those elements that we're touching on, adding the flexible to the traditional model that we're more used to. So that's what it's looked like for me so far. When I look to where I see the key benefits and challenges in delivering flexible trials, there's a huge benefit where we can provide access to regional, remote and rural communities. We're able to really expand that footprint of each of our trials and access a more diverse range of participants and provide more equitable access to trials. So when we have had particularly some of our fully DCTs over in the US, that Ovio Health, the company that I work for, has been involved in running, we've been able to see just how much wider we can reach when we're recruiting for clinical trials, and that we're really getting a more diverse group of participants, and we're seeing regions being involved in trials that have never been involved before. So I'd really like to see how we can do that and mirror that here in Australia, where we obviously have, a geography and a country that would benefit from being able to provide more access to those rural and remote communities without adding the burden of them needing to travel into a central location. You know, from my days working as a clinical trial coordinator based at one of the Brisbane hospitals, seeing just how far some of my patients had to travel to come in for their treatment for the trial, I'd love to see us using the technology that's available so that we can minimize that burden on our participants. But what I've seen is that there's a real lack of trust. Our stakeholders have concerns about approaching flexible trial delivery, and they feel that perhaps there's not enough investigator oversight. I'd like to challenge that with the technology that's available, that if you plan things right, there could be more oversight than a traditional trial. That's something I'm sure that many would want to argue with me over, but that's a discussion I'd love to have, because we can see that there are new ways that we can have oversight, that we can ensure the safety of our participant, that we can collect data from our participants, that we can have their involvement. But there's a reluctance to try something new. We're seeing that whether it's a site that wants to stick to their current SOPs and their current practices, it might be vendors that aren't willing to go out on a limb and invest in a new technology because they're worried that their clients aren't going to purchase it. Sponsors being reluctant to go with the proposals from vendors that are putting forward something new, or CROs that are proposing a new way of doing their trial. And HREX in approving the use of some of these new technologies. But until we have those groups that are willing to try something new, we are going to be stuck. We're not going to continue to make advancements. We're going to remain behind other countries internationally with their approach and how they are taking a flexible approach to their clinical trials. So that's definitely the core challenges that I've seen as I've worked with sponsors and CROs and sites across Australia and internationally in delivering decentralized clinical trials, and seeing that reluctance to be one of the first ones to take that step in a region. So moving forward, how I would see that we need to go to meet, these challenges and move forward in advancing the use of flexible trial delivery in Australia is we need to listen to the participants who are very eager to try something new. I've been fortunate in my research as part of my PhD recently to be chatting to not just participants, but also to several people. I'm sure there might be a couple in here from our industry, about their trust and their acceptance of decentralized clinical trials. And as I've been talking to our participants, they're looking for opportunities to reduce the burden so that they can more actively participate in clinical trials. They are very willing to try new technologies. Even the older population, who commonly I hear, oh, well, this is for an indication for older people. They're all using their smartphones. They know how to jump on Zoom and talk to their grandchildren. So they're willing and ready to try. But we also need to try, and we need to be ready to jump in and give something new a go, get out of our comfort zones. And in doing so, we can reduce the burden for our participants. We can allow participants who might be working full time or have childcare or carer needs and need to be at home and aren't able to travel into the city to go to their hospital, etc., to be able to participate. And we need to be able to be willing to use a lot of the new technologies that are around. There are some amazing things that we can do now with technology and with data transfer in a secure and high quality way. And we need to be willing to try that.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That was really interesting and yeah, just such a good spark for moving on to our next panelist, Jerneen. I'd also note we've got some questions starting to come into the Q&A. Please keep them going. We won't necessarily have any answers, but we'll do our best. And if nothing else, they're things that we can take on board to deal with as part of the project team's work. So thank you so much, Taylor. I'm going to bring Jerneen on.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lisa and Gudrun, for the opportunity to join this webinar and the project more broadly. Thank you, Tanya, also for that beautiful introduction, and Taylor, for you summarising your perspectives. I actually feel like I'm not really going to add anything particularly new. I think you've covered a number of the really pertinent points, but I'll start with a little bit of a background and what does flexible trials mean to me. I've worked in the industry for about 23 years now, and very fortunate to work at a site that possibly was at, I guess, the cutting edge. So at the site that we worked at, we actually had established a satellite site for these very reasons, enabling participants in rural regions to have access to clinical trials. But when I think about then the change in clinical trial delivery models, we come from a highly institutionalised model, and we did see some rapid change through COVID, which was really interesting, and really wonderful to see that clinical trials were able to continue during that period. But there has been a little bit of regression to that very institutional-centric model of clinical trial delivery since the pandemic has started to peter away. What I think is, an opportunity here for us is, as Taylor and Tanya have highlighted, is to offer participants in rural, regional, remote areas the opportunity to participate. The teletrials and telehealth models have been really highly successful. But it's not just participants, it's participants' families as well that I think, and carers that really can benefit from decentralised models, allowing them to participate and have a hopefully a lesser burden in that participation in these trials. What are some of the challenges then? I think the challenge really is having that understanding from an ethics committee perspective of where the study is being conducted. What is that burden to participants? Because as Tanya pointed out, we really want to ensure that there isn't a transfer of burden to the participants, but also that there is that safety and oversight. And I know Taylor touched on that point of oversight as well, and that's really quite a key element for an ethics committee as well as governance as well, to have that understanding of how that will be maintained in the various models. Moving forward, I think really the terminology is key, having consistent terminology, but also having consistent guidelines for sponsors, for sites, and even for participant understanding as well of how that decentralised model will be conducted across different trials. Because I think we need to remember as well that participants quite often do move through different clinical trials, so that if they understand how a decentralised study is performed in one particular trial, having that consistency then for them in future trials is also important if they're going to continue in decentralised trial methods. So that's probably where I'll finish, because again, we've touched on so many fantastic points.
Thank you so much, Jerneen. And I know, your site perspective is incredible as well as your current HREC perspective. And I know that both of those perspectives are going to be ones that the sector is looking towards, and ones we're going to want to make sure that we can address as part of CTIQ's work in this space. And also you mentioned governance as well, and we're already seeing questions in the Q&A about how the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework will fit in with these models and what we can do to ensure that reviews we have both at the HREC stage and the governance stage are meaningful, helpful to protect participants, but also not being done in a way that is going to unnecessarily impede. And so striking that balance is something that all of us are going to need to be really cognizant of. So thank you so much, Jerneen. I will magic you out of the screen and magic Priya into it to round up our panel discussion. Thank you so much, Priya.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we hear you well.
Cool. I think it's a very hard act to follow after Taylor because he's touched on so many points, and Jerneen as well. I think I can speak on behalf of the ATP, and I'm really thankful to represent ATP today. I think with regards to the Australian teletrial program, which is a health equity access program, we do have a partnership with 6 jurisdictions, and that comes with its own challenges. With regards to flexible trial delivery, I would say that teletrials are a subtype or a type of decentralized trial with safety net for patient care built in. And at the same time, it is delivered closer to home, depending on the trial methodology or the protocol. Now, this is coming from our National Steering Committee and the National Leadership Team that teletrials is a model of care and it is a recruitment methodology. And within the model, there is flexibility of delivering it differently at an operational level. And that is what we are seeing with the model itself, that it's evolving in each jurisdiction. It's been delivered flexibly and it's been designed with patients in mind. I think one of the main benefits of the program is offering patient-centered care, including increased oversight. As you would know, that a teletrial is a group of clinical trial sites that work together under the supervision of a lead clinician. With regards to challenges, as I had said, we've got 6 different jurisdictions, and it is a federated system of health. And the main point is that clinical trials, especially in the public health system, they are not considered part of routine care for patients. So it is a major transformational change management program for us, and each jurisdiction are working really hard to attain that. Having said that, we do have 55 teletrials being registered in our database, so at various stages of trials. So as you know, with a lot of trials, there is a startup phase. So some of them are actually in startup phase, but we do have more than 1,000 patients recruited in teletrials. So we are already reaching a lot of patients in regional and rural Australia. I think another challenge is also getting the buy-in across the chief execs in all of the health systems. However, ATP National Office, along with our executive leadership in each jurisdiction, we are trying our best to get that as well for all of our partners. I think with moving forward, ATP will keep innovating. Education which is one of our main pillars. We'll keep providing education and support for sites, sponsors, and HRECs. I would like to finish with the fact that we need to start thinking about trials from the consumer's perspectives, and trial design should consider community needs. And to that end, I'm aware that all of our jurisdictions are working within their state to design trials and work with community so that it benefits the community where the trial is based instead of the other way around. And that's about it. I think everything else is being covered by everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Priya. It's wonderful to hear your views and, of course, be able to represent the incredible work that the ATP has been doing. I think one of the things in the article that Tanya and I co-wrote with others was really this middle point the ATP provides of having that safety net for patient care while also allowing for decentralisation. And it's fabulous to see that work grow and continue, and opportunities to scaffold that work with broader aspects of decentralisation. So thank you so much for that. I will magic you off the screen. No, I magicked myself off it instead. And thank you so much to everyone who has been putting questions in. We will have an opportunity to ask those of our panellists. I can see Gudrun's doing her best to respond in real time, but we'll also have opportunities to present them to our panellists. What I wanted to do now is get back to the hive mind. You've now all had a chance to hear from our 3 panellists on what they think the sector needs to move forward, which is incredible, and I'm sure mirrors many of your thoughts. going to do now is take us back and to Mentimeter, so I can get all of your thoughts on what we need to move forward with flexible trial delivery in Australia, remembering that this information is going to be really useful for CTIQ and the project team because it will help us really gather our own thoughts about what is most important for CTIQ to develop for the sector or issues where we should be most concentrating our attention. So this is your opportunity to help us shape our priorities and outputs. So please do join us at www.menti.com, entering the same code as previously, 12243465. And when you manage to join us there, answer the question of what do we need to do to move forward with this work as in flexible trial delivery in Australia. Yeah, I see collaboration as the first one up there, which is always music to my heart because really that is at the heart of everything that CTIQ does. I see guidance and more guidance in there. Guidance is always really important, but please do feel free to reach out to me directly or to Gudrun if there's particular issues you think we need guidance on, because that, again, will help us shape our outputs in the way that we think will be most beneficial. Both collaborate and collaboration are at the centre, which is really useful and interesting to see, and one that will do our best to help facilitate with the project outputs in terms of finding opportunities to encourage people to speak to each other early and often, and as Taylor mentioned, including speaking with consumers as part of that collaborative voice. I like this idea of give it a go. Sometimes we can want to answer all of the questions before we give things a try, and sometimes that's to our detriment as a sector. Telehealth technology is obviously Priya has brought to us. Sites being able to deliver, of course, and again, the ATP has been doing a lot of work in this space. Guidance and educating the public, again, work that we can be part of, and where there's work you're already aware of, please do let us know and we can incorporate it and work with it so that we're not starting from scratch where we don't need to. Thank you so much. That is incredibly useful for us as a project team to take on board. So with that, that is going to move us to the final part of our webinar before we look at the artwork that Sue has been working away on in the background. And that's an opportunity for questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing now so that we can make sure that we have voices on the screen. Okay. I'm going to start with a question that came in from online prior to the webinar, actually, because we allowed people to pose questions in advance. And the question, one of the questions was, do any of you have or are you aware of an established process that has worked for remote consenting and source document lifecycle for monitoring? So I'm going to look at our panelists. I'm wondering if Tanya, perhaps, Taylor or Jerneen might want to have a go at this one. I see Taylor nodding, so I'll bring them into the discussion.
Yeah, happy to quickly walk through some of the consent approaches I've seen used. So obviously these ones have been using our app that I've been involved in, but they could be done similarly. where we've had participants are sent a copy of the consent form to review, just as they would normally take it away from the appointment, have the chance to review and ask questions. One of the interesting things I recommend to the sponsors and CROs I work with is we put comprehension questions throughout the consent form to make sure that participants are understanding what they've read. And then it's also flagging what areas they might not understand to then have them be asked that by the clinician when they're doing the consenting process. We can incorporate videos as well to show either just explaining the information, which we've done having PIs explain it. We've also had, pharmacists explain how the medication might be administered. And then when we get to the point of signing, they step into a telehealth call. And so you've got the, whether it's the clinician or whoever's consenting on a telehealth, participant then receives a signature and does their signature through a Part 11 compliant signature platform like Adobe Sign. And then the investigator does the same. It then bounces to the investigator, and that's how you can then complete a e-consent process. Very similar to in person, but you've actually got additional steps to make sure that they are reviewing that before they're talking to the investigator.
Amazing. And what about source document lifecycle monitoring? Is that something
that's
come
what's
up
really interesting and it comes back to that being willing to change the way that we approach things. I like to try and see if we can remove the need for a actual source document that's separate to your data capture method and see how we're collecting that information as the primary source and including that. So through the use of HL7 and APIs, a lot of our systems can integrate with each other. Why do we need to print a resource and then stamp it and sign it to say it's a copy to then have someone go and physically review when we can, in some cases, get that information direct from the source transmitted into our EMR or into the EDC that we're using? So in a lot of ways, if we look at different approaches, we can negate the need for that source data, that source document that needs to be physically reviewed. We can capture that data in a new way that we have that proof of originality from when we're capturing it.
Super interesting. I think I'm going to bring Jerneen Williams on screen for that. And I might bring Tanya on screen too, in case she also wants to add to the discussion. So I'd be really interested in Jerneen's perspective from her experience at Bellbury and elsewhere at site level of what HRECs might be looking for when it comes to e-consent. And I think Tanya might have some views on GCP compliance or particularly the monitoring side of things that she might want to add as well.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Taylor. You've touched on some really, really important points there. I think e-consent has come an awfully long way in the last sort of 15 years, and again, really accelerated through COVID. I think there is really broad acceptance now, and again, from a HREC perspective, it's really having that understanding. The committee like to understand how the e-consent will be used in the study. Like decentralised trials, they're quite often approached in a hybrid way, and the format of consent can be quite hybrid in many studies as well, with both paper and e-consent being used. So having the committee understand how that will be executed is one part. I did want to actually touch on the SDV component as well, and this isn't from a Bellbury perspective, but I'm actually putting on a former hat where I was actually a coordinator at a site. We quite often worked with rural hospitals, and this is pre-EMR as well, because Taylor, you've really sort of highlighted the usefulness of EMR, especially when it's a state-based EMR. But, there are also GP visits in rural locations, and being able to, work with those clinics to source verify yourself, so then a monitor can actually come to your site and have, an understanding that the copies of information you have, say from the GP, are true verified copies, is one way of approaching that. But as as technology is, the greater adoption by rural locations, whether it be GPs, etc., it would be wonderful to have that interface as well with CRFs, etc., so that we can cut down on some of those SDV challenges. You might be on mute. Sorry, Lisa.
I'm on it. CTIQ a while ago did a project on e-consent, and I think it reflects some of what Jerneen just said, that often people were quite worried about what an HREC would think of e-consent or how to present that to an HREC, and often it was a problem that was not necessarily borne out by the reality of how HRECs were thinking about e-consent, and they might have questions about how it's going to work and, you know, how to ensure that participants won't be disadvantaged if they're less familiar with technology, how to ensure they're still able to answer and ask questions of a PI, but not necessarily against the idea of e-consent at all. I'm going to pass over to Tanya too, because I also want to hear her views on monitoring, noting her huge experience with ICH, GCP and other guidance documents.
Thanks, Lisa. Going back to consent, you know, two things I want to say about the next GCP, as I'm sure you know, is it is totally risk-based. And I really hope that every single activity that we do, including e-consent, reflects that, because certainly I know the UK guidance probably better than I know the Australian CTIQ guidance, because those one's written, but it gives different, depending on what type of study you're doing, will depend on what's acceptable, whether it's biometric signatures or just tracing signatures or whatever. So that's the first thing. In terms of GCP, obviously, what has always been the case is if it's something to do with the clinical care of the patient, then we need source data. It goes into the medical records first, and then it gets transmitted. But of course, GCP says if you want, you can say in the protocol all the things that just go straight into your, what's it called now? It's not called, CRF is going away from the new GCP, and it's going to be something like data acquisition tool, not surprisingly. So yeah, it can go straight in the data acquisition tool. The one concern, and I know this used to come up in inspections I did with many biomedical research centres in the UK, is actually commercials, mainly commercial sponsor finding, is making sure that the sponsor doesn't have sole control of source data of the investigator. Bang! It was in the last GCP and it's in this GCP, and that is really important. So contemporaneous copies of source data need to go back. So that all needs to be built into the system. Thanks.
I'm going to bring Priya on screen too. And Priya may want to add to the discussion that we've been having about e-consent and monitoring, but I also want to bring Priya on for another one of the questions that has come up, which I'm sure she has great familiarity with through the ATP process, which is how do we address supervision of people, particularly people that might be going to the home of a participant? What does it mean for them to be under the supervision of the site PI? How is that being handled? What questions should we be thinking about? So I know this is something that Suzanne Elliott has brought up in the chat. And I'll pass over to Priya if she's here. I can see her not with video on at the moment. So if someone else on the panel wants to jump in before Priya. No, she's here. Amazing. Priya, do you want to jump in about how ATP has been thinking about supervision, particularly when it might come to remote work being done? I don't know if you've dealt with people going to the homes of participants, but I'm sure you've had extensive thought about supervision of remote assessments.
Sure. I think I can speak on behalf of our jurisdictions because I don't have a site-facing role anymore. But what I learned from our jurisdictions is that it's a partnership between the satellite and the primary site. And I think each of our regional clinical trial coordinating centers are responsible, and they run these because I think for example, for Queensland, I know that our staff within that center, they actually travel to site to support the sites in regards to this. And I think in Western Australia, they have a central service being established so they can control everything remotely with regards, and depending on it, they might even travel if I'm not wrong. So I think that's where, it's the whole supervision and the oversight is something that has to run in partnership, and all the parties have to be agreeable to this, getting into this cluster contract and the cluster agreement. That's what I understand. But again, I'll take this on notice because, again, I'm not in a site-facing role anymore.
Thank you so much, Priya. And I wonder if any of our other panellists have thoughts on supervision, particularly when you might have a decentralisation that involves nursing in the home.
Mind just mentioning a couple
So
of
I'm
things.
just.
Oh, sorry.
No, Tanya, I can go
Jerneen,
after you.
go.
I was actually only going to add one point, and it's probably been covered in previous conversations, and that's really around the comfort of the participant as well in having someone come into their home and an understanding of what that looks like for them. And that's coming from, I guess, two aspects here. One, having the committee having an understanding of how that will be managed and the burden on the participant, but also for the participant to understand the expectation as well for, do they need to, provide special circumstances, a room for the person coming in, etc. And are there other options? Do all visits have to be at the home, or can they do some visits at the institution? Because again, some participants do like to have that opportunity to come in and see not just, say, the investigator, but the other staff as well involved in the research project. So that was the only other thought I was going to add.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerneen. I'll just add one thing to that before I pass to Tanya, which is I've sometimes heard people talk about all trial-related travel as being a burden, and any ways to mitigate trial-related travel as lessening burden. I think Jerneen's added something really important here, which is participants will have different views on what's a burden and what's a benefit, including whether coming into a site or having something in their home is a burden or a benefit, and that is something that is really going to need to be kept in mind. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Tanya. Tanya, I think this is probably going to be our last comment before we move to looking at Sue's art. You're on mute.
I was being good. Right, so the only thing I was going to say is with regard to participants, again, a risk-based approach, does a GP doing a bog standard blood test need much supervision? No. They might not need supervision, but it might be a very important test, so therefore there's oversight from a trial perspective as opposed from a medical perspective. Thinking about those sort of things, I think, is where we're going to have to go. I think that's all I'll say.
Okay, I'm aware that we're at 12:57 on my watch and people may have 1 o'clock appointments or just want to get some food. So I'm going to give us a sneak preview of the art that Sue has been developing, and note that the finalised artwork will be posted on the CTIQ socials and other opportunities for sharing in the near future. So please do keep a lookout for it. But for now, let me give you a sense of what we have so far. So I hope that you're able to see there some of the ideas about what flexible trial delivery might mean, the different components, what we need in terms of background and experience, some of the drivers for decentralisation and teletrials, and of course additional information is going to be added to this, in particular to take into account what we've heard from all of you today in the Mentimeters. So I really hope that particularly the completed product of this, noting it's already amazingly on its way, will be something that all of us in the sector can look to help explain what decentralisation and flexible trial delivery means to us and how to make it happen. Thank you so much, Sue. That's been incredible already. So I hope that all of you have had the opportunity to learn something, to think about bringing flexible trial delivery into your own practices and moving it forward in Australia. I'm really excited that CTIQ's project on flexible trial delivery, that all 3 of our panellists today are members of, and that Tanya has contributed to and no doubt will continue to contribute to. I really hope that that project is something that will move the needle forward, and thank you all for your thoughts today on how we can do that There are a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A that Gudrun and I will go back to look at to see what we can bring into the CTIQ project, what we might have early thoughts on, what might require the whole project team's deliberation. But please do reach out to me or to info@ctiq.com.au if you want to get more involved with the project, if you have questions for the project team, or if you want me to pass questions on to the panelists. Thank you all so much for being part of our webinar today. The webinar recording will go onto our CTIQ website for others to view after the event. And I'm really looking forward to having a chance to see many of you both online and in person in the near future. Please join me in really thanking all four of our presenters today, Tanya Symons, Taylor Major, Jerneen Williams and Priyakshi Kalita-de Croft. And thank you to Sue Pillans and Gudrun Wells as well for their contributions to today. Thank you so much, everyone.